Good afternoon, everyone. Good Monday afternoon. We're all excited to be here on a Monday, aren't we, subcommittee members? And today we are going to start with the MDOT Debt Service and the MDOT Secretary's Office together, and we will have the analyst present his analysis, and then you all can provide your response. Go ahead and come on up. And we have Steve McCullough here, and you may begin when you are ready.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, Steve McCullough from Legislative Services. I will start, if you have it in front of you, with the Secretary's Office. The fiscal 2025 budget for the Secretary's Office decreases by $2.8 million. However, this analysis was done prior to the supplemental budget number 1 being released. With those funds that came in, it's actually increases by just over $500,000 or 0.5%. TAGO is on page 2. You can see the allowance is a $30.6 million reduction to $36.7 million in fiscal 2025. We'll be talking about that in detail. On page 5 begins the managing for results discussion, with Exhibit 1 showing the number of filled positions the department had for each January 1st from 2015 through 2024. As you all have been experiencing the last few years, there have been high levels of vacancies in state agencies. The Department of Transportation has done a very good job. They're has one of the lowest vacancy rates of all state agencies. They have 382 more filled positions on January 1st of this year than the year prior. Exhibit 2 on page 6 shows the month-by-month vacancy rate for calendar 2023, and you can see that each of the modes had a lower vacancy rate at the end of the calendar year than they did at the beginning, with the exception of the Secretary's Office, which is a little different as the new administration coming in has kind of more at-will employees to vacancies to fill. The department's success was a multi-pronged effort. They did some media campaigns, had an open house where prospective employees could talk to current staff. They did a veterans military hiring event, and they moved to a more decentralized position filling where they gave modes more responsibility and authority to fill their vacant positions. So that's kind of how they did it. I do note that the department's cost containment efforts to help balance the CTP does have elements of increasing turnover on vacant positions. So that will obviously have a countervailing effect on the ability to, continue to reduce vacancy rates. And we've asked the Secretary to comment on whether those cost containment efforts will have, an impact on recruitment and retention efforts. The second, managing for results, looks at fiscal responsibility for system preservation. Exhibit 3 on page 9 shows the level of funding. There used to be a $850 million goal in the MFR, and we still show that here with the solid line. However, that goal is no longer stated in the MFR submission, but you can see that for this period, 2016 through 2025 estimated, the agency has had no problem meeting that level. Now, for the last 2 years, with legislation going into effect requiring the Spending Affordability Committee to, for the budget year, make a recommendation on the minimum level of system preservation spending. The SAC recommendation for fiscal 2025 was that the department overall should have a spending of no less than $1.1 billion, which was the 10-year average of spending. However, we do note that the budget as introduced does exceed that, but the gap in state of good repair funding is still growing, even with the 2025 number. And there was a 10-year gap of over $11 billion. So we've asked, again, the Secretary to comment on the long-term system preservation objective, because what the other SAC recommendation was, in addition to 2025, was that the department should try to, within by the end of fiscal 2040, cut in half that $11 billion backlog. And so we've asked the Secretary to comment on whether that is an achievable goal. Exhibit 9 shows the agency spending. For Secretary's Office, I think it's always interesting the fact that half of the Secretary's Office budget is for IT technical services because they support all of MDOT's units, the IT. So a large chunk of that is spent on that. Grants that they give to government and non-government organizations for transportation represent another 17% of spending. That leaves about 33% of the actual budget for the Secretary of $109 million for actual, kind of departmental administration. On page 10 shows the standard proposed budget chart showing the change between the working appropriation and the allowance. As I indicated at the beginning, this $2.8 million decrease, once the supplemental budget, which brought in almost $3.4 million for the Secretary's Office, is factored in, there is actually a slight increase of $572 million, or 0.5% increase. You can see the various categories of increase and change or decrease. Personnel expenses increases by $243,000. One reason that's a relatively small number compared to what we've seen in recent years is that part of their cost containment for the Secretary's Office was a $2.1 million decrease taken for increasing turnover on vacant positions. That's one of those countervailing forces I just mentioned in terms of filling and retaining positions. Departmental administration, mostly related to the computer software and licenses and consultant studies, increased by $4.6 million. At the top of page 11 shows the section of the cost containment. And I will note that total cost containment for Secretary's Office was a $9.7 million reduction. Supplemental budget one, as I indicated, brought in $3.4 million. So that reduction after supplemental budget, was much less than that. And the two items that are in italics on that section show the amount that actually was restored, $1.35 million for various IT software and other contractual services, $2 million in licenses and hardware for the Secretary. The operating grants in aid, you'll see, is a reduction of $1.1 million, mostly driven by grants to metropolitan planning organizations. These are the federally required organizations for transportation planning in urban areas. That reduction is mostly federal funds, and I'll just note that over the last several years, there have been large cancellations at the end of the year that these organizations have not fully expended. So this is pretty much right-sizing that appropriation. And then the final section is kind of the cost allocations, which the department is just instructed by DBM to include in their budget for various services that other agencies provide to the department and other departments. On page 12 shows, Exhibit 6 shows the operating grants in aid. Top section are the MPOs, and then there are some various miscellaneous grants. One I will note, the Pride of Baltimore has a $500,000 grant. This is a mandated grant. There was legislation passed last year that reinstated this $500,000 operating grant for the Pride of Baltimore 2. Page 13, top of the page, shows the personnel exhibit. There are 8 fewer positions in the Secretary's Office than there were in the working appropriation. Those all represent transfers to other units in the department, not abolitions of positions. You can see that the turnover, budgeted turnover, is at 10.4%, which would require 16 positions to be held vacant. However, the turnover cut that they did as part of cost containment more than doubles from the budgeted 5% to that 10% level, which leaves very few, just maybe 6 positions that could be funded for the entire year. The PAYGO capital program begins on the bottom of page 13, and the next page, Exhibit 7, shows the 6-year program by category. As I indicated, beginning the fiscal 2025, which is shown in Exhibit 8, allowance is for $36.7 million. The list of projects that make up that sum shown on Exhibit 8 on page 15. The cash flow exhibit is shown on page 16, and it shows that between the 2024 budget is introduced and the current year working, the program increased by $14 million, and then, as I said, there's a decrease of $31.2 million from the current year working to the allowance. The project changes that make up those $14 million increase and $31 million decrease are shown in Exhibits 10 and 11 on pages 17 and 18. On page 19 is the first year funding exhibit that shows for the Secretary's Office, $4.5 million, or 12% of their fiscal 2025 allowance, represents first year funding for design or construction, with the remaining 88% being ongoing funding. The projects that are receiving first year funding are shown on page 20, exhibit 13, and then the major changes to the Secretary's Office Consolidated Transportation Program are shown on page 21, exhibit 14. The issues begin on page 22, and there's only one issue. Last year you asked for Joint Chairman's report on flexing of federal dollars. Exhibit 15 shows the requested information for 3 federal programs and the percentages that were flexed. We've asked the Secretary to discuss how the department decides what gets flexed from roads to transit. 2 recommendations are on page 24 of both annual budget bill language. The first restricting the operating grants to the amount budgeted. The second requiring notification of changes to the capital program. Turning now to the debt service analysis, the department issues 2 types of debt, or has 2 types of debt. There is the consolidated transportation bonds. These are 15-year bonds that are tax supported. These are basically increase the amount of funding for the state's capital program. Then they have non-traditional debt, which is any other debt other than the CTB or Grant and Revenue Anticipation, or GARVI, bond debt. This is not limited to 15 years, and it may or may not be states tax supported. Currently, all the issues that are outstanding are not tax supported debt. The debt is the CTB debt is limited by 3 factors. There is an overall $4.5 billion limit in statute. The statute also requires the General Assembly to adopt for each fiscal year a limit for that year within that 4.4 limit. And then there are debt service coverage ratios looking at both the net income and the pledged taxes. The prior year's income and taxes have to be 2 times the maximum future debt service. For this kind of forecast period, they are above the minimum 2.0 that are in their bond resolutions. By the final year of the program, they do dip below this 2.5 level the department tries to maintain. Exhibit 1 on page 3 shows the bonds issued, the debt service, and the debt outstanding. You see the green bars. When they go up, those are the issuances. That means the debt outstanding increases and debt service increases as well. For 2023 and 2024, due to a combination of factors, including the federal funding that was available to help support the program, there was no debt issued in 2023 and none planned in the current year, 2024. You can see that because of that, the debt outstanding drops, debt service drops as well. On exhibit pages 4 through 6, exhibit 2 shows the non-traditional debt outstanding. I'm not going to go over each of those. We'll jump right to page 7, which is the recommended action. First recommended action is the annual recommendations, although it's a little bit rejiggered this year. Recommendation number would set debt limits required for the consolidated transportation bonds and the non-traditional debt. The one change this year is that the ability for the department to come back to the budget committees and request an increase in that level of debt that can be issued for the year has been applied to the CTP debt. In case that there is any revenue increase that might be passed this year, that would increase their ability to issue debt to help support their capital program. So they now would have that ability if you adopt that language. And then the second recommendation on page 8 is annual budget bill language requiring them to issue 2 reports on non-traditional debt. Lose the presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. McCullough. And Secretary Wedefield, your response, please.
Regarding the debt?
But you can do whichever one. Why don't you do the debt first?
I'll do the debt.
Because that one's so much fun.
That's right. So there were two recommendations there, and we concur with both.
Any questions on the debt? Delegate Edelson.
Hey, Mr. Secretary, I just wanted to ask you specifically on the Garvey bonds. I know last session we passed a bill, I think it was SB 24, that allows sort of expanded options for issuances of Garvey bonds tied to specific projects. I just wanted to ask if you have any updates for us, if we are planning to issue any of those specific bonds in the near future.
Nothing specific at this time, but obviously it's an option as we work through some of the financial issues we're addressing.
Great, that's what I thought. Thanks so much.
Any other questions on the debt service? Delegate Mangione.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had a quick question. When the department, if they raise fees for something, do they ever use those fees for paying down debt that's been issued, or are those fees, is that totally separate?
We would have already had pledge, the revenue for the debt we have outstanding. If we're issuing new debt, obviously it could be part of that.
Okay. And then with the issue, so since the fuel tax, I guess the motor fuel tax increase peaked in, I think, fiscal year 17, the report says. So how will the increase in the gas tax, affect the issuances of debt over the next 10 years and beyond, especially now that we're hearing, I guess, the number is continuing to decline for how much we're taking in for the gas tax?
Again, we look at all the revenues that we have, in terms of what we could support in debt. As much of an issue for us will be the operating costs, implications that has, because we have another sort of financial constraint that we have, which is making sure that we're covering all of our operating costs and debt service before we can sell debt. So that'll be more the driver than the actual revenue side of it.
Thank you.
Delegate Solomon?
Question's not on the debt, so never mind.
Okay. Any other questions on debt? I don't see any. So, Mr. Secretary, first we would like to congratulate you as being the star agency for filling vacant positions. And I know that your agency directors have worked really hard to do that. So we're very pleased that you have made such progress in filling those positions. But go ahead, why don't you give us your response on the Secretary's office budget?
Great. Again, Paul Wiedefeld, Secretary of Transportation, for the record. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and Stephen for his thorough analysis. I do, again, want to emphasize, that the amount of effort and financial support it takes to support the multi-billion-dollar investment that the state and the citizens have made over the years. And as you know, as we've talked before, we're under tremendous pressure in terms of operating cost growth, some of the issues in terms of the negative outlook for the motor fuel tax, the elimination of the COVID dollars, which was supporting transit in Baltimore, Washington. So I think we're all pretty aware of that, and that obviously impacts our overall budget. But turning to the specific comments made or requested, in terms of recruitment efforts, we are committed to the sustainability department's efforts. We're not going to back away from that. Particularly our frontline people is where we're really focusing on. That's why you saw a lot of that in the different modes. And as part of the budget issues we're dealing with, we are looking at potential soft hiring freezes, meaning we're not eliminating those positions. We may just slow down bringing those positions on board, but we're not going to do that on anything that's safety related. And we're going to try to minimize any impacts it has on customers, just given the nature of the work that we do. In terms of systems preservation, ensuring that we continue to invest the money necessary in our existing system in state-of-the-art repair is critical. Delaying the system preservation work can result in emergency repairs and more significant rehabilitation work that is more costly and more impactful to our customers. With funding challenges ahead and with significant unfunded system preservation needs that the analysts mentioned, we need to ensure that we continue to make necessary investments in our existing system, and we will continue to do that, again, in joint partnership with the legislature. In terms of budget reductions and the impact, the third issue, so whether the questions about vacancies, whether it's about system preservation or operating budget reductions, the core answer, again, always is going to be that we're going to focus on the safety first, part of everything that we do, both on operations and capital. And we'll continue to seek to minimize impacts on our reductions on customers. The budget reductions we made are required to obviously live within our means and are not without impacts. Fortunately, there are tremendous opportunities available now with the vast amounts of federal funding available, and the goals of many of these grant opportunities are well aligned with Maryland's goals to build a more equitable and sustainable transportation system that spurs economic development and connects Marylanders to life's opportunities. And again, we look forward to working with the legislature and continuing conversations and our federal and local partners to offer new ways to meet some of these investment levels that we're all committed to. In terms of the fourth issue, and the final issue was flexing federal funds. It's important to remember that federal funding is a tool to keep our priorities, right? And it's certainly an important tool, but setting priorities is always about defining the priorities first and not the funding mechanism. First, we decide on project need funding. This is based on identified needs and project readiness. Once the funding needs are known, we look at all of our funding options for each project to determine how to fund these projects. When it comes to federal funds, each federal dollar comes with several rules attached to it about how the dollar can be spent, when it is available, and how it has to be reported on, and how much state matches requires. We then make our best efforts to match the projects that are moving forward with the best funding options for each project. Again, what's most important here is the projects that are getting funded, not whether the project is funded with state dollars or federal dollars, but that we're funding the prioritization, a high priority project. The DLS included 2 recommendations regarding the adoption of the annual budget language and department, and we concur with both of those as well. So with that, I'd be glad to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. One of the, I think, overarching challenges we are dealing with as a subcommittee is to better understand system preservation and state of good repair, and the fact that the measure used to be $850 million a year. Now the Spending Affordability Committee is saying we should be at least 1.1 billion, and I believe the budget is close to 1.4 billion this year. Is that right? Mm-hmm. But even so, we have an $11 billion gap over the next 10 years, right? And although we have 1.4 billion in the budget this year, what are the needs for this year? Are they 1.8 billion? Is that what I understand?
In that range, when we think about meeting system preservation, obviously it's monitoring the projects, but it's also the ability to deliver. So some of those, for instance, are on major capital investments like light rail vehicles and things of that sort. So a lot of it gets tied to when you can get things delivered. That's why I talked about the readiness of projects when we figure out how we fund them, because that also plays into that.
So can you explain a little bit more to us about, I mean, we understand sort of MTA as part of it, but what about specifically roads and bridges? And how much of a funding gap do we have in that area versus MTA for the current year?
Sure. I don't believe we have any in the current year, again, but when you look out to the future.
In the next fiscal year.
Yes, in the future, again, it grows because of the aging of the infrastructure. It is driven by different, particularly on the highway side, different federal requirements you have to meet to maintain at a certain level. So that'll drive that number. We're not unique. Every Department of Transportation across this country is dealing with this issue, to be frank, because of the vast amount of dollars it takes to continue to invest in these systems. And then determine at what level do you meet, right? It's just like your house, right? You have a roof that lasts 25 years, but you do it right at 25. If something comes up, do you do it at 20? But if it's still going well, do you leave it to 30, right? And so we have to do that same type of judgment as well. But when you try to project out, you would say, yes, you have this shortfall in that time period. It may push at different times of the year or different cycles. You need something sooner. Other times it may be later.
Can you talk about the state of the bridges in Maryland and where we stand compared to the nation, and whether or not you would put more money into state of good repair for bridges if you had it?
We will not operate a bridge if it isn't safe. So all of our bridges are safe. We do an analysis. Again, it's a federal requirement that you review all your bridges in certain cycles and you determine their usefulness. So again, I'm comfortable with what we're putting into the bridges now. Again, if it's unsafe, we would deal with that. But over the long term, you're going to have, meaning the state, will have to continue to invest in bridges, just given the nature of structures like that.
So if you had more money this year, how much more would you put in?
I don't have a number for you, but again, I would not.
Well, let me ask it this way.
Sure.
Would you put money into state of good repair if you had more money?
Yes.
You would put more money into state of good repair this year?
Yeah.
If you had more money for the entire MDOT budget, would you choose to put some into state of good repair?
Yes.
Okay. Delegate Solomon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good to see you, Mr. Secretary. So I have two sets of questions. One's kind of brief and maybe will require a follow-up. I know I've mentioned this to your team, but just dig a little bit more into it. On the personnel side, so I know MDOT has its own, you have your own personnel system. You're separate from DBM and the rest of the state agencies other than the university system. How much do you have a sense of, will it cost you all to maintain the enterprise systems, the computer system upgrades that are going to be required to keep that personnel system going over the next couple of years?
I don't have a number for you, but we can
Okay.
try to nail down something for you.
I'd like to dig into that a little bit more.
Sure.
So happy to follow up with your team on that. And then shifting gears, actually sort of piggybacking off of the chair's questions around bridges. So I guess I wanted to kind of get your clarification on where we are with the Beltway piece and the American Legion Bridge. Big surprise. And I just want to kind of make sure I'm understanding things. So we're in a place where, we've got about, I'm looking at the CTP here. There's another 70 million in the CTP, but specifically 43.5 million that's in here just for 2025. And that's a big chunk of money, obviously, considering the overall predicament and hole that we're in. So we've got this money in here. It's still, what I'm hoping is some clarity around what this money is going to do, because in my understanding, we've obviously lost out on the federal grants for this year. Your comments on kibitzing with Kagan, I will give my colleague across the way credit and appreciate you talking with her. You very clearly said you didn't think the P3 model was a positive financial model for the state in the sense of this type of project, which I think a lot of us appreciate. And then your comments at the hearing that we had with the Environment and Transportation Committee and Administrator Pines' comment was that the American Legion Bridge still has at least 10 years left on its lifespan. So in the meantime, as we're looking at immediate needs today, and certainly in the next budget year, we've got, again, 70 million in here for planning, sort of amorphous planning on this stretch of road, plus, again, 43 million just next year. Can you explain to me what this money is for? If we're stuck under this record of decision from the previous administration that sort of locks us into a model that in many ways you're saying doesn't work for the state, where does that leave us? Is this back to the drawing board? Is this money getting us theoretically a whole new plan that we can go at the federal government with next year? And I don't mean to be long-winded,
Sure.
but I guess I just need some clarity on that.
Sure. If I could, let me start at a higher level first, which is, the approach that we took, given the current financial situation of the department, is that we continue to do planning and engineering for projects across the state.
Right.
Right, because, you want to be prepared and you want to have a good sense of budget and schedule when you get there. So this falls into that category. So we have a project, we know that we have a deteriorating bridge, we know that there's been history with that project, but we think we should step back, take a hard look at the project, work with the community, think about it beyond just the bridge part of it, think about other alternatives for mobility in that corridor. This is supporting that at the same time, looking at that physically we're going to have to do something to that bridge. So it's trying to do both at the same time, to be frank. So that's what we're trying to do with that.
I don't know if you can publicly say this, but again, if we're locked into a record of decision, and you tell me if I'm wrong here, my understanding, and I am not an engineer and I don't do this for a living, that record of decision that we're operating under from the previous administration has sort of locked us into what is really two toll lanes in either direction. And the previous administration, to a certain extent, felt like the P3 model was the best way to do that. If we are locked into that record of decision, I think for many of the constituents and folks in my county, knowing that we are going back to the drawing board, which potentially means throwing out that record of decision or certainly updating it, I think would make people feel like the process is truly moving in a, I don't want to say a different direction, but in a new means. So is that the right way to characterize it? Are you all looking at throwing the record of decision away or severely modifying it?
No, I mean, I'm not hooked on the P3 as you mentioned. But what we're really trying to do is, if we want particularly transit to work in that corridor particularly, you have to provide the time benefit for that. And how do you do that? Right? You provide a level of service that you in effect guarantee. So that's why we don't want to take that off the table, because that's really what eventually that's what that supports. Because if transit's stuck in traffic, it's very difficult for people to use it. Right? It's just not a choice they're generally going to make. So by maintaining that ability to keep some level of quality of service for vehicle movement, and in this case transit, that's the value of that. So that's why we want to keep all that on the table now as we continue to think through this.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Metzger?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Good to see you again. Tagging off of the bridge, what is the lifespan of a bridge?
It varies, to be frank. It depends on the nature of the bridge. I mean, you can look at bridges that are 100 years old, right, in Manhattan and other places, how much investment you make over time in them.
The reason why I'm asking is that Back River Bridge in Essex, when they built it, they put lights on half the light at the bridge and left the other side. And then it's been probably 40 years since they did it, but then they had very nicely painted, and now the paint went away. But 3 years ago, we had $400,000 allocated to paint the bridge, and then that went away, and then here we are again in 2024, and the bridge is worse looking than it was before. I'm just out of curiosity, where are we at with that? Do you happen to know?
I don't have that, but I'll follow up on that.
I would appreciate it.
I just not familiar with it.
The group that we have that's revitalizing Essex met with the folks in June, and they said by July it would be taken care of, and here it is, almost a July a year later.
So I would suggest that any specific bridges be directed to the Secretary's office after the hearing, if that's okay with everyone. Delegate Mangione.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question, would the transit-oriented development grant program and the planning and implementation, back in Lutherville right now in Baltimore County, there's the big discussion about Lutherville Station and obviously being right next to the light rail. My question, I think, would be, number one, how does the grant program work? And then number two, maybe you can answer this, maybe it's a question for the governor, in terms of, will there be, they call it barriers removed, but I think in one of the housing bills, is it going to basically remove local zoning authority if it involves planning, or transit-oriented community to get the next step? I'm worried that that's going to take away some of the local authority by councilmen that are, or women that are elected by the people that represent those areas. And I think that could represent a real issue in the communities that I represent. And if you can just touch on that. Yeah,
well, I'll come at it from the transportation side. I'll let the
the politics of it will leave to the governor.
But yeah, no. At the end of the day, the way that I look at it, and just so you know, Delegate, I worked at Metro in D.C. for a number of years, and the value that you see around some of those stations down there, the economic value, the community value, that the transit-oriented development, by working with the local, elected officials, is much different than what you see in the Baltimore area. And the state has put tremendous investment in both light rail and heavy rail and MARC system. And I think there are opportunities, again, working with the local, governments, to think about how can we make those better investments for the state and also the community at the same time. So that's sort of our thinking with the TOD. It's not something that you work with the community to get it, but it's tremendous value for ridership it can be tremendous value for a community. And I think if you just look at what's occurred in the Washington region, in Maryland and Prince George's County, just tremendous examples of how that can be.
And for the grant process, I guess that would go for, would it be a developer or the government that receives the local government, and then the grants go towards, I guess, fixing little exits and whatever to get in and out? Where does the grant money go?
Sure. The grant money is as much about working with, again, the community, the development community, because it has to work financially for a development community, or, the development
For a developer,
part of the
yeah.
business. Yeah. So it's identifying those stations. We're particularly focusing right now on MARC and some of the light rail stations and metro stations, but it's working with the development community, obviously zoning, to see where some of these can work. And there's other things that we can do to get out of the way so these things can work. Is there things that we can do to help support it?
Thank you for your answer.
Thank you, Delegate Mangione. Delegate Udelson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Great to see you, Mr. Secretary. I hope that we can have significant success in expanding TOD opportunities around the state. They've been, as you told us, incredibly successful in other areas, and we could really use some of that acceleration and improvement. So I, for one, am excited about the future of TOD options. I wanted to ask you about the piece on flexing federal dollars. This is something that's near and dear to my heart. Obviously, we understand that there's a limited amount of money, and so flexing doesn't create more money where it doesn't exist. It just means we're flexing or transferring from one project to another. And I know you listed a whole set of criteria that you go through when deciding how to flex or transfer certain funds. I think what I'm hoping to get a better sense of is ultimately how those decisions are made, how it is that you weight those criteria and determine where the money is going to go. And two, I think the bigger question is, are we maximizing the opportunities that we have to flex or transfer federal funding? Because ultimately it's a culture shift, right? Mm-hmm. That someone like you have a very different mindset than previous secretaries, and the focus is on expanding options for transit and maximizing every dollar that we have. So that's great, but we need to be looking at what does the future look like so that we have legacy here to ensure that in the future we're always, maximizing options for flexing and transferring the money. So, I appreciate your response. I don't know if it's something you're comfortable to go into now, but I'd love a little bit more detail, flesh on that bone of how exactly we ultimately make the decisions of which projects the money goes into and how.
Sure. I think maybe a deeper conversation would be helpful, but I know what we're doing is we're taking a whole look at the whole prioritization process that we do use for a number, not only for flexing dollars, but for a number of issues. And I think it's important that we do that. Obviously, given the limited dollars we have, but also with some of the other larger goals that we're trying to achieve now that are being articulated, and we want to focus on those more.
Got it. Look forward to that conversation. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
We appreciate that. Thank you. Mr. Secretary, I want to make sure that we understand the number that we were talking about when we first started this conversation earlier. Is the number for system preservation for the next fiscal year, was the number 1.8 million what the need is or was originally? I know that we're funding 1.4 million at this point, but one of the analysts gave us a number of 1.8 that they believe came from you all, and I just want to make sure that we have the right information.
Yeah, I believe that's correct. We'll double check as well. Again, when our first cut at dealing with the budget issues was anything that hadn't started for construction. And then the next obviously had to go towards preservation/operating, and that's what we did. So yes, it definitely hit that to a degree. It doesn't eliminate that need, but we've had to push it out some.
Understood. But it is true that the more you can do sooner, the less expensive system preservation is in the long run.
Yes.
And your department is very good at prioritizing with the projects and the maintenance across the state with, as you said, the first criteria being safety and then system preservation. We want you to know that we have a lot of confidence in you and your department to make these decisions. You're the professionals, you're experienced, you've done this year after year after year in many different capacities. So we really want you to be working with us to make sure we know what we can do to help you with this budget And if that means trying to find another $400 million, then we will try to do that. The main thing is we want our roads and bridges and MTA to be in a state of good repair, the best possible state of good repair that we, the legislature, can ensure for our citizens. And so we're looking forward to working with you to make sure that that happens this year. That is a big concern of the Maryland General Assembly.
Thank you.
All right, then we will now move on to Maryland Aviation. Mr. Secretary, you can stay there. And we have our analyst, Carrie Cook, who will give us a brief presentation on Maryland Aviation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, Carrie Cook to present the budget analysis for the Maryland Aviation Administration. Beginning on page 1, the FY25 budget increases $8.8 million or 3.9% compared to the FY24 working appropriation. That does not include the supplemental budget. So the supplemental added $2.8 million to aviation, which would bring it up to an increase of $11.6 million or 4.9%. On the capital side, on page 2, the budget increases $70.2 million or 48%, which I'll get into in a few moments, to $216.4 million. Moving right into our Managing for Results section, beginning on page 5, Exhibit 1, this shows the total passengers at BWI Marshall Airport. So in calendar 2023, there were 26.2 million passengers, and that is almost to their pre-pandemic calendar 2019 level of 27 million passengers. And in calendar 2024, the agency estimates they will exceed pre-pandemic levels with 29.5 million passengers. Exhibit 2 on page 6 shows the passenger market share. So this is the amount of passengers for the 3 airports in the region, BWI, Dulles, and Reagan. So from calendar 2022 to 2023, BWI's market share did increase from 31.9% to 33.7%. We show this exhibit just to kind of show the competitiveness of the airport, but I will give the caveat that the 3 different airports in the region tend to attract different types of passengers. BWI tends to get more leisure folks, while Dulles has a lot of international travelers, and Reagan attracts a lot of those business travelers. Exhibit 3 on page 7 is the cost per enplaned passenger. So this is how much it is costing the airport for every person that gets on the plane, and that cost is reimbursed to the airport from the airline. So we want to keep that as low as possible. In fiscal 2022, BWI's rate was $11.95, and in the estimate for fiscal 2023, it is going down to $10.79, so moving in the right direction there. Exhibit 4 on page 8 shows the split of fiscal 2025 spending. You can see that the vast majority here is for BWI airport operations. We have a smaller amount, about $7.7 million for Martin State Airport, and then about $600,000 for regional aviation. This is the support for the local airports throughout the state. Page 9, Exhibit 5, has the proposed budget change chart. So again, that increases $8.8 million, and this is not inclusive of the additional $2.8 million in the supplemental budget. So this is mostly due to statewide salary increases, as well as some operational changes, including increasing the janitorial and garbage and security contracts at BWI, and slightly offset by an adjustment to their debt service expenses. As Steve mentioned previously, all of the MDOT modes underwent budget reductions in FY 2025. So Exhibit 6 on page 11 shows the total operational reductions for aviation. So it was a reduction of $20.4 million overall. And so this is offset by the budget increases. So were these reductions not to take place, the overall budget would have increased by $29.2 million, or about 12.4%. So you can see these reductions, again, are from the projected fiscal 2025 levels, what it would have been. So these are reductions in things like information technology, some contractual services at the airport, and changing the type of contract for operations at Martin State Airport. And that $2.8 million in the supplemental budget that I mentioned is the bottom of that first column there. So some of these items were partially restored, including some of that IT funding, some of the contractual funding at BWI. and security staffing at BWI and Martin State. And you can see the net reduction there is about $17.64 million, again, offset by the overall increases in the budget. Moving now to Exhibit 7 on page 12. This is special fund revenues and expenditures. So this is really showing us how well the airport is performing. I do want to give the disclaimer here that all of the revenues collected by MAA and the other MDOT modes are going into the TTF and their expenditures are coming out. But this is just sort of to give you an idea of if the revenues were directly paying for the expenditures, how would they be doing? So you can see here that in the 2024 working appropriation, the operating revenues are surpassing the capital and operating expenditures by about 1.9 million. That's at the bottom in the second column there. So meaning they are putting in sort of a net 1.9 million into the TTF. And then in the 2025 allowance, they expect that net income to still be positive, but a little bit lower. And that's mostly due to the increased planning in the capital program. And the other thing I wanted to point out on this chart here is the continued strong performance for concessions revenue. So from 2024 to 2025, there is an expected increase of 19% in that concessions revenue. That comes from things like parking fees, rental cars, and food and beverage. And that does account for anticipated increase in parking fees that they are taking into account in the fiscal 2025 allowance that has not been proposed yet. And they expect to come forward with those proposals after session. Exhibit 8 on page 14, I won't go through this, but this just shows the status of some federal grants for various capital projects that the agency is undergoing. There's $164 million in pending funding in federal fiscal year 2024, and then you can also see a list of their awarded projects in federal fiscal year 2022 and 2023. Moving on to the personnel section on page 13. MAA's budgeted turnover is 7.7%, and they are below that at 6.28%. So that is a good thing. And there is an increase in positions, but this is actually a technical error. They received these positions in FY23. The data reflects it coming out in FY24, but they didn't. So their positions are the same. They did receive those positions in FY23, and they were a transfer from the Maryland Military Department. Exhibit 9 on page 16 transitions us over to the capital side in the Consolidated Transportation Program. This is their total pay-go allowance by year. So the total program is $1.1 billion, which is a decrease of $44.6 million from the previous program. And that decrease is mostly attributable to finishing first-year construction on some of their major projects. So the total planned expenditures is a little bit lower. Exhibit 10 shows the 6-year pay-go allowance by fund. So the biggest change here is the federal funds, that red bar, that is substantially increasing from 2024 to 2025. It actually increases by 107%. And that is due to the timeline of various projects. So when certain projects reach either the construction phase or start the design phase, they become eligible for certain federal dollars that were awarded. And so that is what is reflected there. Exhibit 11 on page 18 lists all the capital program projects on the pay-go side. I will not go through that and move on to Exhibit 12 on page 19. This is the cash flow changes. So this is showing you how the 2024 working is differing from what was appropriated at last year's session in 2024. Fiscal 2024, excuse me. So you can see that there is a slight decrease here between the working and the legislative, and that's just due to the timeline of projects and how those forecasted expenditures are changing. Exhibit 13 on page 20 shows the first year and ongoing program spending. So there was a requirement due to a bill in 2022 that required the CTP to delineate projects that are receiving funding for design and construction or for, engineering and design or construction for the first year in the CTP. So that's shown in Exhibit 13, and Exhibit 14 just lists out those projects. Finally, Exhibit 15 on page 22 shows the significant project changes from last year's CTP. So there are 3 items that were added to the construction program. This usually happens once they finish the development and evaluation phase. And finally, the issues beginning on page 23. The first is an update on the concessions contract at BWI. We talked about this issue last year. So MAA informed bidders in November 2022 that they were recommending a certain vendor for this concessions contract at the airport. The current vendor then filed a lawsuit. So in February 2023, the agency canceled the solicitation, and then the current vendor dismissed the lawsuit. So in March 2023, BPW approved a month-to-month extension of the current vendor's contract, and that was really just to give them the flexibility to work out what they were going to do in terms of the RFP. And then they issued a new contract, moving on to page 24, a new RFP, excuse me, in September 2023. So they adjusted some of the issues that came up in the previous RFP. The RFP was actually issued by MDOT, by the Secretary's Office, instead of by MAA. They also changed the airport concessions experience requirement, requiring that it be fulfilled by the corporate entity and not the individual executives, which was a concern in the last RFP. And then finally, they added something called a labor peace provision. So what this requires is that the bidder create labor peace agreements with labor organizations that represent employees at the airport. So these agreements essentially allow the employees to unionize and collectively bargain, but they prohibit them from striking or doing something that would sort of interfere with the day-to-day operations at the airport. So final bids in this new RFP, which was issued by the Secretary's Office, not MAA, is due in, were due in early December, and they expect to notify applicants in spring, and then after that's going to be subject to BPW approval. The recommendations for the operating and capital side are both to concur with the governor's allowance, and that concludes my formal presentation. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Cook. In addition to the secretary, we have the executive director of the MDOT Maryland Aviation, Ricky Smith. And I don't know which one of you wants to go first.
I'll start off, if I may, and then give it to Ricky. Thank you, Carrie, for, again, a thorough analysis. The state's aviation system obviously is critical in supporting tourism, economic development, and obviously the air travel needs of Marylanders every day. And we're committed working every day to make sure our facility is the most efficient and user-friendly, the easy come, easy go airport of the region. Ricky will provide more specific details, but throughout our capital program, we're advancing important projects that will enhance both BWI, Thurgood Marshall, and Martin State airports for our customers and provide important facilities for their future growth. In addition, the MAA continues to support 34 public use airports which serve communities across Maryland. And sometimes we forget that we do that as well, and it's an important role for the Aviation Administration. They provide grants that provide important funding for safety at these airports and basically keep them economically viable in those communities. So I want to acknowledge the MAA team, all of the team, for its continued commitment for serving the aviation needs and economic needs of the state of Maryland. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ricky, if you could. Okay.
Before you proceed, I forgot to say that the very informative tour that the subcommittee had at BWI Airport over the interim, and we appreciate all the time that your people gave us and being able to see behind the scenes what was going on, and I think we all have a much better understanding of what you do every day at BWI and also some of the other issues that have come up in your agency. So with that, please go ahead.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Secretary Whitefeld, and thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. We enjoy those kinds of interactions. It allows us to help you better understand the world of aviation. So thank you for the time that you put into that tour as well. So, Chair, members of the committee, again, thank you for the opportunity to present our 2025 budget request. For the record, my name is Ricky Smith. I'm Executive Director and CEO of the Maryland Aviation Administration. I, too, want to thank Carrie Cook for her excellent analysis of MAA's fiscal position. Aviation can be a pretty complex environment when you're not used to it, but her analysis was sound and on point, so we thank you for the time that you put in. At MAA, we work to create and to support a strong, safe, and sustainable aviation system across the state of Maryland. BWI Thurgood Marshall Airport, Martin State Airport, and public use airports across Maryland drive tourism, support economic development, create jobs, and connect our residents and businesses to the global economy. At BWI Marshall Airport, airline and passenger traffic continue to grow, with new international domestic air service. We forecast that passenger traffic should fully recover to pre-pandemic levels by the end of this fiscal year. The MAA has a strong, very ambitious capital program that is intended to support our airline partners as they continue to grow, while also enhancing the travel experience for our customers. Our 6-year projected capital program is the largest in MAA's history, at over $1.1 billion. We have programmed $291 million in federal funding as part of this current capital program, the largest ever federal commitment for MAA capital improvements. The MAA has leveraged increased federal funding levels from the bipartisan infrastructure law, aggressively pursued discretionary grant funding opportunities, and collaborated with federal partners to secure funds to move our capital funding needs forward. This capital budget includes the largest project in the history of BWI Marshall Airport, the Concourse AB Connector and Baggage Handling System project. This major project will provide new services and amenities for our passengers while ensuring Southwest Airlines has the facilities to continue its growth in our market. In December, the final structural beam was added, marking a major milestone in this project. Our capital program also includes other major projects like our restroom improvement program that was recently recognized with a major award, the title of America's Best Restroom. And progress continues on the construction of our major maintenance facility for Southwest Airlines. Southwest is now working to build the hangar portion of the project, which will accommodate 3 Boeing 737 aircraft with exterior apron space for an additional 8 jets. Last month, major structural beam was lifted into place, a significant achievement in the project timeline. Martin State Airport continues to support critical general aviation services, including corporate aviation, law enforcement, and military operations. Last month, the Board of Public Works advanced a major contract to rehabilitate the runway at Martin State Airport. $32 million contract will be underway later this year. This work will help ensure a safe, efficient airport and will shape Martin State Airport for years to come. Again, I appreciate the continued support from the committee. The MAA's dedicated, talented team remains committed to the successful, safe operation of Maryland's airports for all aviation system users. You should have a copy of our PowerPoint deck that provides updates on MAA's air service, financial, and capital program priority projects. The DLS analysis did not request that MAA respond to any items, and the recommendation is to concur with the governor's allowance, which we appreciate and agree. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Again, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Metzger.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, or Madam Chair, sorry. We'll get a promotion there. We had to wake up a little bit. Now, what a joy it is to see you, Mr. Smith. It's a privilege. A couple of things. I see a $20 million decrease in the budget, but then I see 2.8 added back. Still 17 million below. That's a pretty heavy hit. And I guess what I'm saying with how good you are doing, I just don't understand. Is that a cut that would be able to help you or hurt you, or what's your thoughts on that? And you can be honest with this group.
Well, that's the only way I could be, sir. Thank you for the question. Well, I think it's fair to say that that any cut to any agency would hurt, right? But we figured out a way to manage through the reductions. These are responsible reductions that we're making. They won't compromise our ability to maintain safety and security at the airport. They won't diminish the customer service that we establish at the airports. And so we'll live with the cuts. We'll make them work, and we think we'll continue to make responsible decisions in the midst of those cuts.
I have a follow-up, but I'm cautious to use that. But do you think that there's a way that we can increase the funding for that in future? I have a bill in for like slots, casino, not a casino as such, but just a study. Do you think that would help the funding? As I know you.
Feel free to answer that as you see fit.
Well, I wouldn't want to get ahead of the
Right.
legislation or the study.
Right.
I think the outcome of the study will bear out the impact that it would have on the airport.
I appreciate that so much. But the last question is the labor piece provision. Did they, have they unionized, or is that still taking place, or what is that?
The labor in which respect?
On the request for proposals issued?
That would be for the new contractor.
Right.
Yeah. So that has not been
That hasn't
determined.
taken place
Not
yet.
yet.
Okay. Thank you, Madam.
Sure. Delegate Solomon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It was good to see you again. I would echo the chair's sentiments. We really enjoyed. I know I really enjoyed, and so did my son, the pictures of our visit to the airport. And congratulations on the bathroom award. They were really spectacular. And
I'm
honestly,
trying to get to a point where I don't have to talk about bathrooms anymore.
I mean, but this is a great thing. And if you haven't been, for all the millions of people watching, make sure you stop in the bathrooms at BWI before you get on your flight. I had two questions for you. One, I don't know. This may be a little bit of a weird question in terms of the funding, because it's kind of like how do you process something that in some respects doesn't exist? But on the fees, to a certain extent, in places where you're cutting here, some of these were obviously restored by the money that was put back in the budget. But how much of what is here, things like the janitorial services, things like vegetation control and airfield marking, are things that you could reasonably roll into added fees to either concessionaires or to airlines? I know there's a set amount that you can charge. It has to be revenue neutral to a certain extent, but like airfield markings to me seems like something that would be important to an airline. How much of this that was cut from FY25 could be restored, but not on a restoration from the rest of the fund, but restoration on fees or things captured from users of the airport, not necessarily individual people?
Great question. Thank you for the question. So the financing model at the airport is that everything we spend on the airfield is reimbursed 100%. In the terminal, it's approximately 60%. On the land side, it's 100% us. And so, yes, there are cuts that would be reimbursable through that model. However, we are able to continue to provide the services despite the fact that we have the reduction.
Okay, well, clearly some of them we can't because we've restored back. So, I mean, I guess maybe that's a broader conversation. I mean, I know you all have been a great entity in adding money back to the trust fund, so, but money's tight. So anything we can do to try to recoup some of those costs. And then I guess the other question, one of the things that was not mentioned in the budget, and I know we talked a little bit about it when we were visiting, is the fees on rental cars. And so I'd be curious if you can tell me, where does BWI fall in terms of our rental car fee versus what somebody would be paying if they're flying in and renting a car from Philadelphia, renting a car from New York, or renting a car from DCA or Dulles?
Yeah, so we often compare our fees, not just rental car fees, but other fees to that of other airports, because we consider ourselves a low-cost airport, and our fees generally compare favorably to those. Our rental car fees are the same. They're generally lower than what you would find at the other two airports in the south of us, much lower when you compare us to other airports across the country. So
we could theoretically move up a little bit and not be completely out of the realm of the average of the region.
The answer is yes.
Okay.
Could, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Delegate Edelson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Great to see you, Mr. Smith. Just to put a fine point on it, I know that you won Restroom of the Year award, but the biggest accolade comes from my 7-month-old son, who thought it's just the best. He spent a good amount of time in your restroom over Thanksgiving, and he just loved it. And his dad was okay with it as well. I wanted to ask you about, you don't need to comment on that, we can just leave that as it is. But congratulations. I wanted to ask you about the emergency radio system and the status of the upgrades to that system. Where are we at? What can we expect?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. So we are going through the process of preparing to put an RFP on the street to upgrade our radio system. It's a complex procurement because we have mutual aid arrangements with other public safety service providers around the airport. And so we want to make sure that we're able to maintain communications with those mutual aid participants. So we're pretty close now to being able to put something on the street in order to upgrade our radio system.
Got it. Thank you.
And the system is currently operational, and there aren't any issues with it currently?
The current system is operational, is reliable. The new solicitation will allow us to upgrade the system, but it's not replacing a system that is not operating now. The system is working fine.
Okay. Back to the areas that are being cut. I know that you said that you can absorb them, and you've carefully decided what will be cut and what will be funded. But I do note the America's Best restrooms, are they going to be affected by the contractual janitorial services cut?
No.
Oh, that's good to hear. Good to hear. Okay, and when you have information technology, $3.3 million cut, you're not, I guess, here's a question that would be good for you to share with us. If you had more money, what was the first thing that you'd reinstate?
So just to provide some more context on the cuts, obviously there's a need for the funds that are going away. But to try and to come in line with the fiscal policy for this budget, we're deferring certain projects, right? And so we will still look down the road for opportunities to cover those costs. And so we're not necessarily eliminating the need, we're just deferring how we pay for the cost of those projects.
So for example, information technology, you are deferring some of those projects that you were going to take on?
Yes, so we're looking at, there's some technology projects, and the reason why some of the funding was restored, there's some technology services that are just beyond useful life, and they're customer dependent, and so we just have to fund those projects. There are others where we're able to stretch a few more years, and that's what we're doing with these reductions.
And if you don't mind, if we could ask one more question about the cuts. That's the $470,000 reduction to security services staffing levels and security system upgrades. What exactly would that $470,000 that's being cut have done for the airport?
So, and that's for both BWI and Martin State Airport.
Okay.
At Martin State Airport, we were looking to expand the security presence there. So we're not going to move on as ambitious a security expansion program at Martin as we anticipated. We're going to push that out a little bit. At BWI Marshall, I mean, we'll continue to provide the basic level of security. There were some areas where we wanted to take on more responsibility in partnership with TSA. For example, we wanted to take over responsibility for manning exit lanes. We will not be doing that. TSA will continue to have that responsibility.
Explain exit lane.
So each security checkpoint has a lane where passengers who are departing aircraft exit the concourse onto the public side of the airport. Those exit lanes have to be staffed by a security force. For the most part, TSA is staffing those exit lanes. We would rather have TSA deploy those staff at the security checkpoints so that we can provide better service there. But we're going to defer that changeover to a future year and allow TSA to continue staffing the security exit lanes instead of us taking that over.
Okay. How are we doing on planning for the future needs that we may have at the airport in terms of runways?
So right now we have the capacity that we need. We are in the early stages of a master planning process that will examine the future capacity needs of the airfield, the entire campus, to be honest with you. And so as we get through that process, we will better understand what the capacity needs are. I can't speak to that today.
Sure.
From a maintenance standpoint, we have an ongoing need to repair pavement that is heavily represented in our capital program. We have certain segments of the airfield, particularly around gates on D and E and our gates on C and D, where the pavement is below the acceptable grade levels, and so we have programs in place to replace that pavement. But for the most part, the airfield capacity is a non-issue.
And the master planning process will wrap up when, roughly?
Well, we haven't started it yet, but it would probably take about a year after we officially launch the process.
Okay, so within the next 3 years or so, we'll have a master plan, roughly?
Within the next 3 years, you said?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
The next 3 years.
I'm giving you extra time.
Thank you.
Okay, there was one other question. Which member has it? Delegate Ruff.
I don't know if I have
I'm
the
just-
question.
The
I
last
had-
question is what I meant. There's one other question.
I think it's probably Delegate
Okay,
Mangione.
go ahead.
But I did want to jump in if possible and offer my kudos to you, Executive Director. We very much appreciate you, and I'm sure the Secretary appreciates the job that you're doing. We're proud of you. I just want you to know that, and proud of the work that you've been doing for so many years. I wanted to follow up from
Can you say that to Delegate Ellerman's son, please?
I wanted to follow up from some discussions that we had during the site visit, which again I will piggyback and say it was a really great experience to be able to kind of go under the belly of the beast and to see how everything is operating. You talked about at our site visit the fuel storage expansion project, and talked about how we really needed to have maybe even up to 8 days worth of fuel storage available, and that we weren't quite there. I think you were saying that it was somewhere around just under 4 days. Is that am I remembering that correctly?
So we typically want to be at least 2 days. And so we're normally hovering around 2 to 3 days in terms of fuel capacity. Yes.
Okay. Is that fuel storage expansion project still happening? I think I see that, the additional tanks, and it looks like that from what my notes shows, it was somewhere an estimate of around 22 million. It looks like it's going to be about 25 million now at this point in the 6-year program. Can you talk a little bit about whether that additional storage, gas storage is on track, and kind of how it affects your budget as well?
So yes, again, thanks for that question. Yes, that project is on track. It's a very important project for us. We're adding 2 additional fuel storage tanks that will allow for us to not just contain or maintain our current level, but this is for future forecasted growth as well. And so, yes, that project is on track. It is funded, and we're moving forward with that. An accompanying effort is that we've also entered an agreement with the non-Southwest Airlines carriers to form a consortium to manage the non-Southwest fuel tanks. They are able to manage them in a more efficient manner than we would. They're going to make investment in those tanks that they'll be responsible for, so that will add some additional efficiencies as well.
Okay, thank you.
Delegate Mangione.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question. Now, you mentioned the Southwest is having this big, a construction project to help Southwest, which is great, because I guess they're doing a ton of business out of BWI. How do the discussions work, for example, with other airlines and to get them to either come and be based out of BWI, or airlines to make sure they don't leave BWI? Are there incentives and discussions about further, I guess, construction for other airlines? How does that work, and who has those discussions?
Again, thank you for the question. So we have an air service development office that goes all over the country, the world, meeting with prospective airlines to, in some cases, to introduce them to the prospect of operating out of Maryland, out of BWI, and in other cases, we're providing them information to help them make decisions to deploy aircraft in this area. We do have an airline incentive program that is approved by the Board of Public Works that allows, it is regulated by the FAA, so there are some limitations of what we can do. But in essence, what we're able to do is to engage in cooperative marketing to help them market the new service that they offer out of this region. And we also abate their landing fees for up to 2 years. The FAA is looking at expanding that, but right now it's up to 2 years. All airports have the ability to offer those incentives. We think what makes us attractive is that we are a low-cost airline. And so we've had success with attracting low-fare carriers, both domestic and international, and we're optimistic that we'll continue to be able to do that.
That's great. And is there more room for, how much room for growth for, I guess, more airlines could the BWI handle?
Well, we have the capacity to handle more. I can't tell you how much more, but I don't think the secretary will let me be in a position where we turn down an airline because we don't have space, right? We figure out a way to accommodate the airlines whenever they show interest in the airport. As a matter of fact, it's an FAA requirement that we take reasonable steps to accommodate any carrier that wants to operate out of the airport.
It was very interesting. I never had any idea how that worked, and unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend the tour. But airports are fascinating, all the moving parts and logistics, and you never really think about some of the behind the scenes, like who has those discussions to bring these mega businesses into Baltimore or Washington area and to make it all work. So thank you for what you do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Mangione. The last point or question I wanted to bring up was about the proposed change flight patterns to do the airport noise. We have gone through a long process, and you have been terrific to work with the communities that are affected by the different airplane noise. And now we're close to the end of that process, and I just wanted to give you a chance to say where exactly we are.
So first, let me thank you for the compliments. I do want to recognize and thank the roundtable for their leadership on this. I mean, it's an amazing representation of the communities that were affected. Our roundtable model stands out as a model around the country that the FAA has encouraged other communities to follow because of their work in partnership with MAA, the team at MAA, as well as a couple airlines, Southwest Airlines and I believe Delta. They were able to make a recommendation to the FAA to correct procedures that were implemented back in 2013. The FAA is planning to implement those corrections for departures in May and then for arrivals in July. And so they're well on their way to putting in place procedures that we expect will address a lot of the concerns that have been raised over the years. I don't think it will eliminate all of the concerns, but it will go a long way in addressing many of them.
Yes, and those original changes were made, did you say in 2013?
It was 2013, 2014. Yes.
Right, so the roundtable has been working, and the legislature and the local county councils and local citizens have been involved in that. And it's really a model of how a process should work. And we appreciate your stewardship of that issue.
But thank you for your leadership as well.
Thank
Chair.
you. All right, anyone else? Thank you. Thank you very much, both of you. And we will now have the Office of People's Counsel. And we'll have Samuel Quist, who will give us the agency analysis on that. And Mr. Lapp can come forward if he is here. You may begin.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Samuel Quist from the Department of Legislative Services. The Office of People's Counsel, the budget increases by approximately $655,000 or 9.3% to a total of $7.7 million in FY25. You can see on the first page of the analysis that the office is primarily funded through special funds from the Public Utility Regulation Fund. On Exhibit 1 on page 2 for the overview of agency spending, you can see about 47% or $3.6 million of the budget funds agency personnel costs. About $3.5 million funds outside consulting costs, which are outside subject matter experts and consultants that assist PSC staff in the proceedings it's involved in at both the state and federal level. Exhibit 2 on page 3 for the proposed budget changes. Personnel expenses increased by approximately $118,000. Outside consultant costs increased by about $526,000. And are impacted in decreases in fiscal 2024 spending in this area. So the FY25 budget is roughly similar with FY23 actual spending in this area. The personnel data summary on page 4 shows there are 22 total positions in FY25, and there is a net change of 0 in positions in FY25. Turning to the key observations section, key observation 1 is a discussion of the agency's workload and staffing levels. A committee narrative in the 2023 Joint Chairman's Report asked OPC to submit a report to the budget committees on this topic due to questions that were raised last year over whether the agency staff size has increased in proportion to its workload in recent years. Exhibit 3 on page number 6 is showing data on OPC case participation and favorable decisions in the cases that OPC is involved in. You can see that in fiscal 2023, there were a total of 235 cases that OPC was involved in, including 96 before the PSC, which was about 41 more cases compared to fiscal 2022. You can see from Exhibit 3 that the case participation rate has generally increased in recent years. The report from OPC also discovered additional factors in addition to the number of case participation due to the complex scope of some of the matters it has been involved in. For example, multi-year utility rate cases, additional changes to the OPC's statutory workload that were enacted in Chapter 607 of 2021, which expanded responsibilities to include the consideration of environmental impacts of the state. On pages 8 of the analysis is further discussion on the proposal of OPC for additional staff. OPC outlined that 10 additional positions would be needed to sustain the current workload and enhance the agency's ability to meet its statutory responsibilities. OPC outlined that these 10 positions would be at a cost of approximately $1.5 million in additional personnel cost. In its report, OPC outlined a proposal where the statutory cap on assessments on revenue going to the Public Utility Revenue Regulation Fund could be raised in order to fund these costs. The report noted that in the fiscal 2024 allowance, the budget of OPC was approximately $2 million lower than the maximum statutory cap that year. However, due to increases in the fiscal 2025 allowance, that gap decreases, especially due to any additional increases in personnel expenses. The final portion of this report, on page 9, OPC was asked to conduct a comparative analysis with other state utility consumer advocate functions. Exhibit 4 on the bottom of page 9 shows comparison of data of the OPC budget with budgets of similar agencies in other states, as well as staffing size. Of note, the Office of People's Counsel for the District of Columbia had a budget of approximately $12.3 million in FY23 and 56 positions, which is over double the size of OPC in Maryland. And you can see that in the states of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, which had roughly the same sized budget in FY23, there were 12 to 13 more positions in those two states. On the other end of the spectrum, in Delaware, the total budget was about $1.1 million and 6 full-time positions. To conclude, the DLS recommended action is to concur with the governor's allowance. That concludes the presentation for OPC.
Thank you. And we will now go to Mr. Lapp.
Thank you very much, Chair Watson. I'm here with, I'm David Lapp, People's Counsel for Maryland, and I'm here with Krista Robusky, who's our Chief Operating Officer. We appreciate Mr. Quist's analysis, and we concur in that analysis. Appreciate all the work that went into that. I'll just mention a couple things. We are involved in virtually everything that goes on before the Public Service Commission, and so that involves rate cases, work groups, task force, studies, pretty much anything that happens at the Public Service Commission, we are involved in at some level. I wanted to mention a couple things that are sort of outside of the Public Service Commission that we work on. And we spend a good amount of time working on regional issues and federal issues because a substantial portion of residential customers' electric bills in Maryland, over 50%, come through federal regulation, and that's through the Regional Power Pool Operator and Transmission Planner, PJM, which is regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So we are active there. Another thing that we do, which is part of our statutory responsibility, we're tasked with investigating and asking the Public Service Commission to initiate proceedings. So our task isn't just to see what shows up at the Public Service Commission. It's also to see what doesn't show up and pursue those matters. And if we need to, ask the Public Service Commission to initiate proceedings. So we've done that in several different instances. One is on federal funding. We petitioned the commission about a year ago to initiate a proceeding on whether the utilities are taking advantage of federal funds. Those federal funds can replace ratepayer dollars, so it's important to maximize that funding. We've also asked for a petition on gas planning, long-term gas planning. Commission has opened dockets in both of those proceedings. We also file complaints with respect to individual utilities or retail suppliers. Retail supply is another area that we're very involved in terms of trying to address largely deceptive advertising by marketing practices of those retail suppliers. Finally, I would just say that we have a very committed and dedicated staff. Over the past year, we've had a significant number of rate cases and other proceedings at the commission, and they've worked very hard, many of them logging significant extra time, comp time, and a lot of those lawyers are really passionate and committed to the work, and we're asking quite a bit of them. We do work hard to be efficient in what we do. We're significantly under-resourced relative to the utilities and to other parties that are before the commission. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, members. Delegate Edelson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, David. It's great to see you. Two questions for you. One is sort of on a larger scale. We are in this sort of long-term struggle to change how we produce energy and to go from fossil fuels to renewable sources that are better, obviously, significantly for our planet and the future of our planet. And as we do, that puts us in a struggle with the utility providers that don't necessarily want to make those changes because they're not as financially viable for them. I'm wondering how, as we continue this struggle over time, how you see the role of the People's Council potentially expanding. One of the big things that you've spoken about is multi-year rate cases and how much of a challenge that is and how complex those are. So I'm curious of how you see the Office of People's Council playing a role as we continue down that path of looking to produce better renewable energy for the planet.
Well, I think we play an important role in terms of getting information, and that often that means evidence in actual proceedings in litigation before the commission. So we're one of the only parties that is there in virtually every big rate case, and other there's a lot of different work groups and task force set up, and we are a consistent major contributor in all those efforts. And so we put on testimony in those cases, and we are very much a part of our responsibility, which has been actually put into the statute in recent years, is to consider the state's climate goals and environmental objectives. And so we certainly take that to heart. At the core, our commitment responsibility is to protect residential customers, and there are numerous things that the overlap is significant in those areas because, for example, electrification is cost effective for residential customers, especially when you look out over time. And not just because of changes because of climate policy will make changes and mandates, but also just because of just changes in technology. So we certainly see our role as making sure that the Public Service Commission in moving forward, recognizes those things and has an evidentiary basis to advance those objectives.
Great, thank you. The second question I had is on retail choice and the role that you play in trying to hold bad faith suppliers accountable. I'm wondering if you can give us ideas or thoughts on what your work has revealed, and if there are steps that we can be taking to try to fix that challenge, which affects all of our constituents, but certainly mine at a particularly disproportional rate. There's a bit of an ebb and flow to the complaints, but they don't seem to be slowing down. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how we can collectively try to solve that challenge.
Have lots of thoughts. I would say that one of the first things, I was appointed and started in the beginning of 2021, and one of the first arguments I made before the commission myself related to a retail supplier that had been found to have violated Maryland consumer protection laws and really harmed customers. And one of the points I made there was that these retail suppliers, if they aren't addressed, if they aren't deterred, if they continue to profit despite being caught, you're essentially playing a game of whack-a-mole. So there's got to be effective vetting of those companies before they receive licenses so we can keep the bad players out. And then when they do get caught, we need to make sure that the remedies, and that they range from, suspending or revoking a license to penalties, civil penalties and customer refunds. And what we've seen over time, and much of this is prior to the recent changes at the commission, is that those penalties were insufficient to deter. Companies were still finding it profitable. They were caught. They were caught deceiving customers or, slamming customers, changing their provider without their permission. And they were still allowed to operate and actually retain some of the profits that they gained from those activities. So we have a couple bills in the General Assembly this session that that we're working with the sponsors on to address some of those problems, but we also think that the Public Service Commission itself can take a number of measures to address a lot of these problems. And the Commission has an open proceeding that we filed extensive comments, to the Commission about what it can do under existing law. So we file complaints, we litigate against these companies. We have a number of cases at the Commission and in the courts related to retail suppliers.
Got it. Thanks.
Delegate Solomon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's nice to see you. Thank you for being here. I just had a quick question for you, and I'm going to ask, I guess I'll telegraph my question for the Public Service Commission folks. So, the numbers that stood out to me in reading the Public Service Commission analysis were obviously the 30% rate increase, give or take, for average electricity and natural gas prices over 2 years in the state, and then the significant increase in arrearages and shutoffs from pre-COVID levels. And so I was curious, I want to hear your perspective, and then I'm going to ask the Public Service Commission folks as well. Are those warranted? What's your thoughts behind those numbers?
In rate cases, we don't come in with a knee-jerk reaction to just oppose the rate increases. We do need the utilities to raise rates if they need to adequately serve customers. But we have opposed substantial portions of a number of those rate increases. It depends on the case, but we've often been disappointed in what has been approved. We have multi-year rate cases, which we have been pushing back against because they shift a lot of risk to customers, and they create some incentives for utilities to invest in capital expenditure and capital assets that serve to increase rates significantly, especially as you look out into the future.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Delegate Ruff.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you guys for being here as well. I kind of wanted to follow up on the questions about personnel as well. And I fully understand your position about the additional personnel needed for the workload. I'm a practicing lawyer myself. So I wanted to know, are you able to talk about the competitiveness of the packages that are offered for these potential personnel, whether they are meeting the competitive, the needs of this competitive, market for, especially for practitioners. Would you be able to fill these positions? Do you have any issues with recruitment as far as meeting the salaries that attorneys and legal or folks in the paralegal or staffing needs that you might have? Would you be able to fill those positions, and would that be adequate? And would that be another kind of basis for your request or position to raise the current cap level?
Excellent question. Thank you. It is a significant challenge to recruit people at the state salary levels, and also to retain staff, because we work in a very specialized area of law. And so, a lawyer, even an experienced lawyer that is coming from a different field, requires, substantial education and investment. And that education and investment becomes, that's with the individual. And so that individual becomes valuable outside of the state. So the challenge is identifying, getting people to come, but also retaining them once they, learn what we do, because, there are certainly better paying jobs outside of the state. I can tell you we have, we have hired a really talented staff, a lot of young and experienced lawyers, and some with substantial experience in this area. And they're with us because they care about customers, they care about our work. We should not have to depend on that, and we should not have to depend on their willingness to, work extra time. So we are working hard internally to try and, make sure our attorneys have manageable workloads. But part of that is also, a need to, expand the staff, with those, understanding those challenges.
Yeah, for the legal practitioners, for the actual attorneys that you're looking to hire, how far off do you think the packages that you're able to offer from your agency are from, another state or from the private sector?
We're probably not. I don't really have great information about salaries in other states. I imagine we're in the same range. We're substantially less than the private sector. I mean, some of our lawyers could probably easily double their salaries by going to the private sector.
Thank you.
Mr. Metzger?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a follow-up question on the hiring. I know you have probably a marketing program to try to enhance lawyers to come. My thought was, I know judges are supposed to retire at 70 years old. Is there a possibility that you could maybe reach out to some of those retired judges and try to get them come on board? Just a suggestion.
We'll certainly consider that. We haven't done that. I think we do need to explore creative ideas like that. So appreciate that. Yeah.
And the final question I have for you is, we see in your analysis the number of hours of comp time that the attorneys build up because they are basically working overtime. So in an ideal world, how many more positions would you need to fulfill all of the duties that you have accepted over the last few years through the legislature?
Well, ultimately, we think to really do the job that our statute entails, we 10 more positions would really, we think, would largely get us there. Of course, we recognize that that's ambitious. So any number, short of that is, I mean, every additional position we have can make a big difference in our office.
Okay. Well, good. Well, thank you very much for being here, and we will now move on to the Public Service Commission, and
Thank you.
our analyst may proceed while Mr. Hoover is coming forward, the chairman of the PSC.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. The Public Service Commission, the fiscal 2025 allowance increases by approximately $1.8 million, or 6.9% to $27.9 million. Similarly, with OPC, the Public Service Commission is primarily specially funded through the Public Utility Regulation Fund and also has a small portion of federal funding. Exhibit 1 on page number 3 for the overview of spending in fiscal 2025, you can see that the majority of the budget, around 77%, supports personnel expenses. The second largest portion is for outside consultants, about $1.9 million. Similar with OPC, these are outside consultants and subject matter experts that assist the PSC staff with cases and other proceedings. The other area of spending in the budget I would point out is there are $1 million for contractual service costs related to Chapter 95 of 2023, also known as the Power Act. This was the offshore wind bill that passed last session. There was a budget amendment that added funding in fiscal 2024 as well. So those contractual service costs are estimated to continue. Under the proposed budget changes on page 4, under salary increases, there is a $1.3 million increase. This includes $600,000 of increase as the estimated cost of 8 new regular positions in the budget. Outside of personnel expenses, the largest increase is the $1 million related to Chapter 95, which I mentioned previously, for the contractual services costs associated with that bill. There's also $100,000 worth of contractual services costs related to Chapter 652 of 2023, which makes permanent the Community Solar Energy Generating Systems pilot program. Under contractual personnel expenses, these costs decreased by $100,000. This is related to the contractual conversion of 3 contractual positions to 2 of the regular positions. The largest decrease in the budget is $400,000 from the Retail Choice Customer Education Fund due to the conclusion of a contract for customer education materials, which expires at the end of fiscal 2024. On page 6, under the personnel data summary, you can see that there are 8 total new positions funded in the FY25 budget. Of these, 4 are related to Chapter 95 of 2023, related to offshore wind. 2 of the positions are related to Chapter 652, related to the Community Solar Pilot Program, and 2 of the positions are as a result of the contractual conversions I mentioned previously. In addition to these 8 new positions in the budget, there was also an additional 1 position that was created in fiscal 2024 through the Board of Public Works. The analysis notes that there were 15 total vacant-wide positions department-wide at the end of calendar 2023, including 4 that had been vacant longer than 1 year. The analysis is asking PSC to comment on efforts to fill long-term vacant positions in the agency. Turning to the key observations section in the analysis, the first key observations section is a discussion of utility terminations and arrearages and increases in residential electric and natural gas prices. I would point out on Exhibit 4 on page 9, which is focusing specifically on outstanding arrearages, you can see that in the beginning of calendar 2023, in March of 2023, the monthly amount of outstanding arrearages actually reached its peak in the past 5-year period, exceeding the previous high, which was achieved in October of 2020 during the height of the pandemic, which is notable. Although these arrearages by month through the remainder of calendar 2023 have shown a decrease, if you compare to prior the pre-pandemic period, these arrearages are remaining elevated. Exhibit 5 on page 10 shows data on terminations for select utilities. You can see that these are also elevated above the pre-pandemic level. And in August of 2023, the monthly number of utility terminations reached its 5-year high in a single month at around 19,000. The second issue discussed in the analysis, as mentioned in the previous budget hearings, complaints against third-party retail energy suppliers. Exhibits 6 and 7 on pages 11 and 12 present the total number of complaints filed against third-party suppliers. Exhibit 6 shows that between calendar 2020 and 2022, there was around 415 to 446 complaints filed annually. Exhibit 7 on page 12 shows complaints per month between January 2022 and June of 2023. You can see there was an increase in January of 2023 and February of 2023. Exhibit 8 on page 13 discusses the primary reasons that the PSC found for the submission of these complaints against third-party suppliers. The primary reason was the issue of slamming, which is defined by PSC as the illegal practice of switching a customer's electric or gas supply service without their permission. The second most common reason was misrepresentation, which is defined by PSC as false or deceptive statements in an effort to enroll customers. Exhibit 9 on page 14 is summary data on the 10 zip codes with the highest concentrations of supplier complaints received. Within this data, 8 out of the top 10 are concentrated in Baltimore City or portions of Baltimore County. The report that was submitted by PSC discusses some of the actions that it has taken in recent years. Since calendar 2010. PSC has taken action 19 times against 16 total suppliers and has assessed total civil penalties of over $2.5 million. Lastly, in this section, exhibit number 10 on page 15 presents data on third-party retail electric supplier enrollment. As you can see on this chart, in 2013, third-party retail enrollment reached its peak at about 28.1% of eligible utility customers, and every year since has declined. In calendar 2023 through November, retail choice enrollment declined to about 15%. Exhibit number 3 on page 16 briefly in this section summarizes that the Southern Maryland Electric Cooperative was awarded $33.6 million under federal funds available through the IIJA Act, which is the first Maryland utility to date to have been awarded federal funds. The final section of the analysis I'm going to just skip over briefly in the interest of time is a discussion of recent developments in the offshore wind sector. There's been a lot of attention in this area, so there's some additional discussion there. To conclude on page 20, the DLS recommended actions are to concur with the governor's allowance. I will end the presentation there, and I can take any questions. Thank you.
Any questions? Okay. Mr. Hoover, over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm Fred Hoover, the chair of the Maryland Public Service Commission, and with me is Amanda Best, the Deputy Executive Secretary. At the outset, I'm going to try to respond to some of the issues that were raised in the analysis, and I appreciate the analysis presented by Mr. Quist, and we obviously concur with the governor's allowance, but I may have to be somewhat cryptic in some of my responses just because some of the issues and some of the matters that have been discussed today are actually matters pending before the Public Service Commission. So there is, in a sense, we're like a court, and so there's a limit as to what I can opine on when it comes to that. That being said, we have been working to try and fill the vacancies. We have some of the same challenges that Mr. Lapp discussed in the sense of trying to compete with not only the private sector, the federal government, but also a lot of national public interest groups. We're trying to move the staff of the Public Service Commission to become more responsive to the challenges presented by climate change, which means we need to change some of the types of personnel that we have at the Public Service Commission. Unfortunately, those folks are in high demand in the industry and by national groups and now the federal government. So it's been difficult to recruit them, but it's an effort that I spend a lot of time on. On the arrearage issue, as was mentioned, the Public Service Commission has an open docket examining. It was started during COVID because the Public Service Commission imposed a number of restrictions on what utility companies could do when it came to billing and collection practices and termination of customers during the COVID period. There was a shift after COVID decreased as a concern to move back to the more traditional practices that were in place. I expect that the Public Service Commission is going to conduct an investigation later this year on the issue of termination policy, and in particular, probably looking at the policies that exist in the summertime. We have fairly extensive regulations that deal with what utility companies can do during the wintertime because of the concern about cold weather, but quite honestly, hot weather is just as dangerous to customers. And so we probably need to do a deeper examination of our current policies related to what companies can do when they terminate service during the summertime, particularly during peak heat periods and long-term heat waves. On the federal funding issue, we have, as was mentioned, an open docket on that, where we've been examining the activities by the utility companies and seeking money from the federal government. There are some funds that are made available to public service commissions and to other state agencies, but a lot of the money in the federal funding laws are actually designed to fund projects, so therefore those are things that utility companies can do. And we will be encouraging the utility companies to seek as many dollars as they can from the federal government, because it's my attitude that obviously that money should be spent here and not somewhere else. And then on the issue of retail suppliers, there has been an effort in place. It was started by my predecessor, which he referred to as maximum enforcement, where he charged the Public Service Commission's technical staff to do more in-depth investigations of bad practices by certain retail suppliers. Those cases are now percolating up through the commission. We approved a settlement just the other week against one retail supplier, and I expect more of them to come. What I have done since I've been there since July is encourage the staff that when they review applications for companies that want to come to Maryland to provide service, to pay particular attention to if the company is operating in another state and actually has complaints against it in another state, that should be a red flag for us to not approve their entry in service here, with the thought being if you're a bad actor somewhere else, you're likely to be a bad actor here. We have also, I testified the other week in support of the Senate version of the bill that it would do substantial revisions to the current practices overseeing retail energy suppliers. I expect to testify later this week in the Economic Matters Committee on the House version of that bill. I think after 25 years of deregulation, it's probably time for us to take a large and detailed examination of the current rules and regulations that apply to retail energy suppliers and see what we need to fix to eliminate the bad actors. There are some companies that are offering services in this state based on price, based on the quality of their electricity, based on the services, and that's all fine and well for customers who want to do that. Unfortunately, there are a number of companies that have attempted to try and elicit customers through deceptive means, which was mentioned in the analysis, slamming and misrepresentation and things like that. We should take actions both at the Public Service Commission and in this body to see that those types of activities are eliminated so that retail energy choice becomes a consumer benefit and not a consumer trap. And with that, I will respond to any questions.
Delegate Solomon, can you do it quickly?
And we can follow up more about this. You know, I mentioned this to the People's Council, and I know you were there for many years. Just again, the rate increase piece, you know, 30% over 2 years, higher than average for the rest of the country. You know, would love your opinion on it. Maybe we can follow up later and what's going to be done going forward.
Unfortunately, that's the one issue that I really can't talk a whole lot about, just because, I mean, we're in the midst of deciding those rate cases. We, you know, issued an order in the BG&E multi-year rate case. We have the PEPCO multi-year rate case coming up. And we also have a different examination later on this year to look at the issue of multi-year rate filings as to whether or not they will continue, because it is technically a pilot. So unfortunately, there's not a lot I can say. We try our best when we view the evidence presented to us by the parties, the company, OPC, and other large customers, and come to our decision on that. But there are a lot of factors that go into what the price winds up being.
Thank you for that. And Delegate Solomon, you may be excused to make the quorum at the capital budget meeting, which starts
And
in
I'll be glad to
2
follow up with
minutes.
you in more detail. So.
And Delegate Metzger also may be excused wherever he is. Okay. Is he going to the capital budget? Okay, perfect. Delegate Maggione.
Quick question. In terms of the grid grants, are there ongoing conversations about protecting the grid, whether that's from cyber attacks or potential, it could be a terror attack? And also, is there a track record of, I guess, keeping track of whether or not there are threats that have already been made on a regular basis? Can you touch on that?
Sure. So, and actually, this body last year passed a significant bill that gave us more authority in the cybersecurity area and the ability to hire some cybersecurity experts. It's a topic that's looked at both at the federal level and at the state level. We have a lot of interactions with the public utility companies to make sure that their systems are protected from hackers. I mean, the good news is it's actually relatively difficult to hack into a utility system to cause disruption. That being said, there are entities that know how to do this, and it tends to be sort of state-sponsored, as opposed to the ransomware attacks that you see on banks and hospitals and things like that. The people that want to hack the utility system are actually looking to cause social disruption and terror and things like that. So they tend to be state bad actors. Because of that, there's a fairly significant federal involvement. There's a whole separate federal agency that oversees the reliability for the grid. And so it's an issue that's constantly being looked at both by the federal authorities and by our agency to make sure that we keep the grid safe.
Great. And on the second part of that, is there, I mean, maybe you don't have an answer to this, but is there threats that have constantly made, or am I just worried about nothing?
No, actually, it's a decent threat.
Maryland,
I mean,
obviously.
You know, I think, as I mentioned, I mean, I think the concern is that those entities that want to cause social disruption either to a state or to a city or to this country, you know, so, you know, the usual suspects, so to speak, you can think of who, based on world events that don't have our interests at heart, those are the people that we have to be concerned about. I mean, the clearest example where this happened was a few years ago in Ukraine when the people who invaded Ukraine with troops actually invaded their utility system. And what was found after they did an analysis of that was that the hackers were actually in there for a long period of time, just sort of poking around the system, figuring out what the countermeasures were, and then they waited till the Christmas holidays when the utility grid system had, you know, sort of low-level attention and things like that to launch their attack. And so we learned a lot of lessons from what happened, unfortunately, to the Ukrainians to make sure that those types of things can't be done here. And so far we've been lucky enough, but it is a very serious concern.
Okay, so there's not a list of, you know, previous potential.
No.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Mangione. Do we have any other questions? Delegate Edelson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Hoover, 2 questions for you. One is, you know, we've had maximum enforcement for about a year now. I know you mentioned the thought of looking at the rules as a holistic way, but in the short term, do you feel as though we have the tools necessary at our disposal to really implement a maximum enforcement strategy, or are there additional tools that would help you?
Well, I mean, not to testify on the bill that I'm going to be testifying on later this week, but I think the one key thing that we might want to look at is under the current system, when you get a license to sell electricity in the state of Maryland, you get a license to sell electricity and there's no review of that unless you do something bad. And the current process is basically complaint driven. You know, if there's a requisite number of complaints to the Consumer Affairs Division of the Public Service Commission, they then work with the technical staff to bring an action against the company. But the concern I have is it's a fairly long process. And so the customers that have been harmed, you know, that harm exists for quite a while. And while I think that the enforcement mechanisms, the tools that we have to ultimately sanction these companies are pretty good, I'm just concerned it's going to take a while to get that. So I think the idea of a renewal of the company's license is probably a pretty good idea so that we can do a little look-see at them to make sure everything's been going correct on that. So that's the one specific tool that I would say. The other thing that I've been concerned about is this business model of retail energy suppliers who hire an outside third-party entity to do the door-to-door solicitations with iPads. And, you know, my thought is if you're going to make the choice to switch suppliers, it ought to be based on a reasoned judgment. So if you get, you know, either an email from a retail supplier or even a phone call where you have the ability to sort of check, you know, what's going on, what they're telling you with the information that's available actually from the Public Service Commission, that's a better process than somebody standing at your door trying to high pressure you into a sale.
Agreed. When it comes to the license renewal idea, would you recommend a fee associated with license renewal applications?
Well, I'm not so much, I mean, probably maybe some sort of fee just to sort of actually probably help cover some of the costs, but I just think that the time situation is a more important thing so that we get a chance on a regular basis to renew what's going on. And if, you know, if you're doing fine, you want everything to worry about, but if there's an issue, then we can bring it right to their attention and get them to focus on doing a better job.
Got it. One other question. You recently directed a correspondence to the Full Appropriations Committee regarding the personnel challenges that you've had and a request to increase the statutory assessment cap that is applicable to the PSC. In that correspondence, you also referenced the assessment cap that applies to the Office of People's Counsel, but you didn't request an increase in their statutory assessment cap. Is that any reason other than the fact that it's a different entity?
Yeah, it's a different entity. So, I mean, they can, you know, speak for themselves. And you know, I didn't want, I mean, I think they're in agreement that if you raise the cap for us, you should raise it for them. And I guess the nice thing about our two agencies is that we don't come out of the general fund. We actually come out of a user fee. So, but there was concern expressed to us by the Department of Budget and Management that some of the stuff we were trying to get funded was putting us too close to the cap. So,
and we appreciate that correspondence and have forwarded it to the Economic Matters Committee, where they will take it up at this point. And we also encouraged the OPC to also be in touch with ECM so we can.
And we just actually had a similar conversation with your counterparts across the street. So.
Great. So hopefully you can get that through at ECM, and then we can talk about additional resources.
Yes, which we would greatly appreciate, because there's a lot of challenges that are being presented, you know, not only to Mr. Lapp's office, but to the commission on, you know, how to deal with the change in technology, the change because of climate, you know, affecting the energy industry, and trying to keep the lights on and keep the rates affordable is a difficult job, and we need all the expertise we can get.
You absolutely do. And we appreciate that fact, so we will be assisting you as we can.
We
Any
appreciate
other
that.
Questions from our little committee that's left?
That's right.
All right. We are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.